Hey guys, and welcome back to Kingdom Students. My name is Brian. I have the honor to serve as the student pastor here at Kingdom Life Church. And this week we are finishing up our study in the book of Judges. If you've been with us over the past several months, then you may know that we've been in several different series, but it's all been a study through the book of Judges. And we're finishing that up with the last two chapters that we're covering in the book of Judges. That's Judges 17 and 18. Now, that covers the last two Sundays in a row because we had a fifth Sunday, and so we had two messages back to back. And in Judges 17 and 18, what we see is the very beginning kind of descriptions of the fracture that's beginning to happen for the nation of Israel. We talk really specifically about two main things that are going on. We talked about this guy named Micah who had developed this pagan shrine at his house, and then he hires his son to be the priest, and then he ultimately ends up hiring this other guy that comes along that claims to be a Levite as priest. And then we talked about how there was this group of guys from the tribe of Dan, and they pass through, and they're actually planning to attack another Israelite kingdom because they want a place for themselves, and they end up stealing the priest and kind of getting him on board with taking everything in Micah's shrine so that they can set it up as their shrine for the tribe of Dan. And we talked about how all of this actually has some real world implications in 2020 because it reveals some things that we have to kind of begin to look at as not necessarily a physical fracturing the way Israel is fracturing with some of the stuff that's going on, but more of a spiritual fracturing, right? So there are some commonalities between the fractures in the nation of Israel and what fractures begin to form in your life when you drift farther and farther away from God, right? And so here's what I want to do. I want to spend the next few minutes talking about some questions that you can think through yourself as you spend some time with God this week, that you can talk through with your family, or that you can even talk through with your friends, especially if you have friends that attend Kingdom Life. And if you don't, that's fine. Like, you can talk to them about this crazy story that you read about in the Bible, and you can begin to have some of those spiritual conversations. But here's the first question I want you to ask yourself this week. Why do you think so many people in Israel failed to recognize the depths of their own sinfulness? And I say that because if you remember back to when we first got introduced to Micah, the way we were introduced to Micah was that he had stolen some money from his mom, and that he had given that money back to her, and that she actually rewarded him for giving the money back, even though he stole it in the first place. And not only did she reward him, but she took some of the money and she had it melted down and formed this idol. And she'd given this idol back to Micah as kind of, again, a reward for his behavior. And in all of this, she even dedicated this idol to God. And we talked about how in just the very beginning phrase, the very beginning passage of Judges chapter 17, there's so many things wrong with Micah and his mom and their relationship, and the things that ultimately end up happening. And all of this is without any regard to how sinful their behavior had been. And this continues not just with Micah and his family, but with everything that we talked about over the chapters in Judges 17 and 18. They just didn't recognize their own sinfulness. And so I want you to kind of think through, why do you think that is? And then the next question I want you to kind of wrestle with is can you relate to a culture that chases after what it wants instead of chasing after what God wants? And I mean, we talked about this in depth in the message. Like, all of this is very similar to our culture. There's from really specifically Samson, but you can make the argument even earlier than that. There's this theme in the book of Judges that Israel did what was right in their own eyes. They chased it after what they wanted. They didn't really care about the things going on around them or the people around them. They chased after what they wanted. And we kind of talked about how that's our culture, right? So I guess knowing that it's really easy to relate to the things going on in the culture of Israel at this time, I want to push that in a little bit further and ask you to think about specific ways that you can identify how you can relate to a culture that chases after what it wants. Because that's all our culture says to everybody, right? Like, go after what you want, chase your dreams. Like, you got to do what you want. You got to pursue your will. You got to pursue your passion. You got to pursue your talent. Like, it's all about what you want. It has nothing to do with God, because our culture largely has devolved into a secular culture that completely ignores God. And without God as kind of the driver of purpose, the driver of purpose becomes your own passions and your own desires. So think through how you can relate to some of the things that are going on in the culture of Israel at this time. Now, we also talked about the tribe of Dan, and we talked about how those guys had kind of wanted to have their own land, right? And so this is the third question I want you to kind of walk through. We talked about the reason they wanted to do that was because they felt like they had never been given land. And that was really a callback to Judges 1, where we see that Dan actually is given a spot of land in the promised land, and they ultimately fail to conquer the people that are there. They fail to drive out the inhabitants that are in that land, right? And we talked about how that's really significant because they ultimately tried to do it by themselves and they couldn't, and nobody in Israel, none of the other tribes helped them conquer the land. And so this was the very beginning of the fracturing that we kind of see come to a head at the end of the book of Judges. Now, one of the things that I want us to kind of look at is that they didn't trust God's plan for giving them this section of land, and ultimately generations later it leads to a tribe in Israel attacking another tribe in Israel, right? And so how does that play out in our life, right? Like, how does it play out when we fail to trust God in our life? And have you ever felt that way? Have you ever been pursuing something and you pursued that thing because you honestly didn't feel like God had your best interest at heart? Like, I can say from experience, I've been in those moments, and they're not proud moments when we look back, because we kind of tend to look back with hindsight's 20/20, and so we see, hey, God had everything orchestrated if I had just listened. But in the moment, sometimes there will be times that you feel like God doesn't have your best interest at heart. And so how can you can you describe one of those times that you've walked through that? Now, let's go on to the fourth question that I have for you today. What can you say as a follower of Jesus to those that honestly begin to care more about their own passions, their own desires, their own motives, the own will that they have over the truth of a given situation? And the reason I asked this question is because we looked at Micah and the Levite, and we saw that Micah had a desire for his purpose, for his will, for his happiness, and it didn't matter that the Levite's resume didn't quite line up. And so I want us to kind of wrestle with, how can a follower of Jesus talk to somebody who has a better, more clear focus on their happiness, and that tends to be their focus more so than truth. How can we have a conversation with them when our goal is to represent the truth of the gospel? Like, what does that look like? And that's not an easy question to answer. It's more of a discussion question. And the whole reason for these is we're in small groups right now having these questions. And so I want you to be able to have these questions again with your family, with your friends, or even just think about these things, because they're important things to think about as we grow in our walk with Jesus. Now, here's the last question I have for you today. What can we as Christians do to turn the tide of a culture that's headed down the same path that we see Israel heading down in the book of Judges? Because we talked at length about the fact that there's no happy ending in the book of Judges. In fact, we're actually stopping short with verse 18. There's other chapters in the book of Judges that we're just not going to cover because it gets worse than what we've already discussed. Like, there's some really dark stuff that ends up happening in the book of Judges, and there's no happy ending. And so if there's no happy ending in the book of Judges, and we see our culture and see the similarities of the things that are going on in the book of Judges and the Israelite culture, and we see there's some similar things happening in our culture, how can we as Christians turn the tide of that culture? What can you do as a follower of Jesus to impact the culture, to begin to kind of change some of the negative things that you see happening? Right? These are real questions that we need to have, that we need to ask, so that we can be a part of the ultimate purpose that God has for us, and that's that everyone would have an opportunity to hear and respond to the gospel. Right? So if you're a follower of Jesus, you're a part of that. So I want to encourage you to try to identify how you can have an impact on culture this week. Guys, we are going to be back on Wednesday with another message, another midweek Bible study, and then we're going to be back next Sunday starting a brand new series that I don't want to give too much away, but I'm really excited about it, and I really want to encourage you to join us. You can join us in person at 416 Holland Road in Simpsonville, or you can join us online here with the Kingdom Students page. We're going to be live for the message here. And we would love for you to really join us and begin to have a really impactful conversation. We'll dig more into that stuff coming up in future small groups. But I want to preface this: if you have ever had kind of a desire to think about the philosophy of the worldview of somebody who's a follower of Jesus, like, we're going to be talking about some of that kind of stuff in the next series that we have on a Sunday morning. So I really want to encourage you to join us for that. But until Wednesday, I just want to remind you that God loves you. He has a purpose and a plan for you, and He wants you to be a part of His plan to redeem the world. Thanks for hanging out with us today, guys, and we can't wait to see you for our midweek Bible study on Wednesday. Bye.
It's not a game, it's a rage thing.